Welcome. My name is Ron Graneri. I am a senior fellow here at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and I also happen to be a professor of history in the Department of National Security and Strategy at the U.S. Army War College. So today I am here in two capacities, both as a convener for FPRI and some of my colleagues here from the War College. So the U.S. Army War College was founded in Washington in 1901. It is now based in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. It aims, in the words of Secretary of War Elihu Root, who founded it, not to promote war, but to preserve peace by intelligent and adequate preparation to repel aggression. Today, the War College provides land power-centric 10-month graduate education to select military and civilian leaders from the United States and allied nations who already have about 20 years of experience in national security. Their diverse courses of study help prepare them for the next level responsibility as senior leaders within our armed forces, our government, or those of our partners. For more than 50 years, the U.S. Army War College's Eisenhower Series College Program, or ESCP, has been designed to encourage candid dialogue on national security and other policy issues between War College students and the broader public. An elective program born out of the experience of the Vietnam conflict and its impact on the War College's hometown of Carlisle. ECSP students now travel across the country, speaking to college classes, voluntary organizations, think tanks, and other public forums. Today, FPRI is pleased to welcome 3 representatives of the Eisenhower program to present their ideas and engage in just such dialogue. Our topic is U.S. national security and soft power. Ever since Professor Joseph Nye coined the term to explain the special ability of the United States to attract and hold international support, soft power has become something of a magic incantation. As American leaders have relied on it to fill the gaps left by resource constraints, our adversaries have speculated about their ability to manufacture and deploy it. In an era of increased great power competition, both the United States and its rivals will need to know both the possibilities and the limits of soft power in shaping the international system. Our guests today are 2 members of the U.S. Army War College class of 2025 and 1 member of the War College faculty, and they will offer their perspectives on soft power. They aim to provide an informed practitioner's perspective rooted in their experience of connecting the tactical to the strategic. We value the dialogue we have with our audiences, so after they offer some brief opening remarks, we will then open the floor to your questions. We look forward to the dialogue. So who are our speakers? So starting on my extreme right here, Colonel Jody Daigle has served in the U.S. Army for over 20 years. A 2002 graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point, he held numerous infantry and special forces roles with 6 combat deployments to Iraq and the southern Philippines. His career additionally is focused on the Indo-Pacific region, strengthening military capabilities through international partnerships and in diplomatic roles at U.S. embassies in India, China, and the Philippines. Colonel Daigle holds master's degrees from Nanyang Technological University in Singapore and the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, specializing in strategy, leadership, and international relations. Professor Alexandra A.K. Misa is a visiting professor of national security studies at the U.S. Army War College and associate teaching professor at the Northeastern University School of Law. Professor Misa spent over a decade in legal practice preventing and resolving international disputes before assorted U.S. courts and international tribunals. She has also worked for war crimes tribunals in Cambodia and Timor-Leste, in international development in countries such as Yemen and Bosnia, and on election administration, observation, and strategy in Europe, the Middle East, and the United States. She likes to keep busy. Her contributions have appeared in assorted media outlets such as Just Security, the New York Times, the Columbia Journal of International Affairs, the Secure Line podcast, and NBC. And finally, Lieutenant Colonel Lee Turcotte is an Air Force civil engineer and explosive ordnance disposal officer with 20 years of experience. His experience has ranged from Afghan provincial reconstruction to leading bomb squads in combat, to render safe roadside bombs, to overseeing the Air Force's European construction portfolio from the Pentagon. His 8 deployments include 4 trips to Afghanistan, plus Jordan, Iraq, Kenya with the UN, and post-Katrina, New Orleans. He also likes to keep busy. His other overseas experiences have focused on supporting European allies, and he has particularly enjoyed working with NATO in various capacities. He has a bachelor's degree in civil engineering and a master's degree in international relations. So with no further ado, I'd like to open the floor to my colleagues to speak. Start with you.
Jordan, go ahead. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. We had a great day. We started at 10 and we talked on the same subject to them, to a different audience. And we tried to relate kind of my own school experience to theirs. And then what I did with them is frame something that they'd be familiar with and kind of challenge you to kind of go through this mental exercise yourself. So I had them like picture like they're in school, they're doing well, and all of a sudden they get this assignment that kind of drops in their lap. And it's an important assignment added to the school curriculum. And it's so important that this assignment is going to make or break their whole college experience. And, you know, what people are used to nowadays and challenge wise, it's probably just another day, another challenge. Let's get through this. But what really scare a college student, what scared me as a college student, is the concept of that project that's so important being a group project. With group projects that they're fundamentally hard to deal with, and it's taking different ideas, different people together, and even if you know the way that you want to go, it's hard in a group to get everyone aligned. So that's kind of the example I set up for them, and I kind of explained that, you know, when I graduated from West Point, it was 2002, and it was the year after the 9/11 attacks, and we're focused on counterterrorism. And as I went out, you know, that fear of group projects manifested because over the past 20 years, I've learned that our national security, global security, is really a big group project, and it's tempting for us to kind of go out and go at it alone. I have an idea of how to tackle a group project, but it doesn't always work effectively unless you get the whole group together. And so I want to provide two experiences that I've experienced in my time that will help highlight that point. You know, one in Iraq and then one in the Philippines. In Iraq, the concept of attacking that group project with our Iraqi partners was a concept that I was bringing a lot to the table. I was motivated and young, and I knew where the project needed to go. So I took that initiative and built the project team. In the Philippines, it was a little bit different to where I couldn't run with my idea because I had to focus more on enabling the other elements of our partnership to solve this problem together. And so I'll explain as we go through these two scenarios, kind of the pros and cons and where I see the future of sustaining a secure peace. So with Iraq in 2003, when we first went in, I was motivated. I was a young, combat trained West Pointer, and our focus was on terrorism, to keep America safe and attack the terrorists, defeat and destroy anything we saw. And in my mind, I was thinking of it in terms of we're like what we see in the movies with the Avengers and all the heroes that they find a villain, they assemble a team, let's get after the villain and beat the bad guys. And in Iraq, the bad guys were Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And that's how we focus. We developed systems and tools, and it was a rocky road, as you all know, in that period in the Iraqi war between 2003 and 2011. But ultimately in 2011, the terrorist threat subsided, and by 2011, the Iraqi government felt that they were secure enough, and it was okay for the US military to leave because Iraq was secure. And we thought that was success. And in terms of the mental model of a college group project that we're all working on together, we, as a US military, we did our work. We saw the vision of where this group project needed to go. We did our work, and then we took that work and we gave it to the Iraqi military and said, okay, now you just finish it off. Like we 90% of the work, the rest is yours. Good luck. And we thought that was success. But 3 years later, ISIS emerged, and they came out of Syria, rolled over into Iraq. And even though we had trained 15,000 Iraqi security personnel, ISIS quickly overran the Iraqi military. So I found myself and our special operations teams back in Baghdad, helping the Iraqi government desperately protect its capital city from getting overrun. So I had to pause for a moment there and think about what led us to this? What critical element did we miss that security didn't last in Iraq? And I look back on how we approached this type of group project. is we had a vision and we did the work. And then when we gave it to the Iraqis, we assumed that our Iraqi military counterparts had the capability and the will to continue the project that we built. And I saw that we didn't really have that cultural awareness to realize that a lot of what was underlying that military structure, the religious and political divides, would slowly undermine all the efforts that we put in. So we built something, and what we built slowly eroded in the military units over the series of 3 years. And by the time ISIS came in, the system that we built quickly crumbled. And so that was one experience in Iraq, of approaching a group project with a lot of gusto, but it being our answer, the US military answer, not our answer in the greater sense of our partners. But then I also went to the Philippines, and in the Philippines, they had an insurgency problem in their south, and terrorists were using that insurgency to plan operations and conduct attacks. So the Philippine government asked the US military to go in and assist. And we did, but with the one caveat that the Philippine Constitution prevented US troops from any combat operations in the Philippines. So the only thing we could do in the Philippines was train our Philippine military partners and look at all the soft power elements that existed in the Philippines and leverage those and help and enable each of those entities to work together to achieve the security. So for me as a young, motivated officer, I was feeling a little bit, it was ineffective or not as direct as I had wanted to be. And one example was we had a terrorist bomb maker that our intelligence told us this person lived about 2 miles away from where we were. And had it been Iraq, we would have assembled our team, gone out and then captured that bomb maker. But going through the Philippine system and training them to conduct the operation, it took about 2 months to finally get there. And that was frustrating for me in the short term. But years later, all of that collaboration led to unprecedented success. In terms of, in 2017, when ISIS was expanding all over the world, they also expanded into the Philippines, and they overtook the Philippine city of Marawi. They displaced 200,000 people from Marawi and got a foothold in the Philippines south. But it was the Philippine military who had the capability and will to push back. And they planned a 5-month operation to go back and reclaim their city, push ISIS out of their country, and then lead all the soft power rehabilitation efforts to rebuild that city. And that was all them with a little bit of US support. So when I look back at that situation, I was like, wow, this is a lasting stability. And when you compare the two, Iraq and the Philippines, two very different security environments. So it's really hard to compare the two. But what I'm comparing isn't the intensity of the fight. It was the approach that we took on how we were going to conduct this group project of global security with our partners. When we went into Iraq, even though in the short term, we were effective using our answer alone, it didn't last because we didn't have complete buy-in from the people that were going to be there when we weren't. But in the Philippines, because we couldn't go at it alone, we had to understand all the stakeholders in the environment, pull them together and help enforce kind of what they represented and what they were going to do long term. And that was a model that, even though it was slow and maybe frustrating at the beginning, that was what had lasting effects. So that's kind of the comparison that I'm taking away from this. And it's not a model that applies just only to counterterrorism. All the challenges that we face globally, and it could be global security, it could be climate change, economic security, all these very complex challenges we're facing require as many actors participating as we can. So it's in our interest, if we want that lasting solution that keeps on rolling after we're gone, it's understand our partners, understand what they're motivated for, and understand how we can build them up. So, and that was the challenge that I issued the college students, and I issued to you today, is identify these group projects, so to say, that you're invested in, whether it's personal, academic, or in some part of the global environment that you're really passionate about. And in the short term, it's okay to focus on kind of how you contribute and where you want the organization to go. But to build lasting long-term effects, it's really about understanding how you can empower others that will continue to succeed long after you're gone.
That's correct. Sandra.
That's my turn. So as Ron mentioned, I am on loan from Northeastern University School of Law, so that means I'm a lawyer. And when thinking about the topic for today, and what does soft law mean? What are soft law mechanisms that exist? I immediately think about law. And I think about law because if we then think about what is national security, I look at it as having 4 Ds. We've got hard defense, these guys, okay. And that's what most people think of when they think of national security. But we have diplomacy, development, and democratic governance. All 4 of these rely on frameworks of law, domestic, international, and otherwise. And the United States has historically been a model that others want to follow when it comes to law. If we think about the post-World War II mechanisms of international world order, we even refer to it as rules-based order, right? This implies rule of law, and that law is involved. The United States is at the forefront of the negotiations of many of the most important international legal mechanisms today. UN Charter, Universal Declaration on Human Rights, even later institutions such as International Criminal Court. Yes, we have unsigned it, but we were involved in the negotiations of it and other things like this. And you mentioned Joseph Nye, of course, coined this term soft power. We look at it as soft power is this ability to attract, but also positive associations that people have with you as an entity. Okay? So these can be formal and informal. I mean, we think about the Cold War, right? It's Beatles, Rolling Stones, Blue Jeans, right? Radio Free America, all this different stuff. This is part of the soft power that was then. Today's soft power, we can look at South Korea. How many of you have seen the movie Parasite? How many of you watched the movie, the TV show Squid Game? You hear that your kids or your grandkids are listening to K-pop, right? South Korea kind of outpunches its weight right now. And that actually, we could say that's soft power that Korea has from a cultural influence standpoint. But back to the law. I've been asked a lot lately about, is international law even relevant? Does it matter? Right? Is there enforcement? Who cares? What if people ignore it? This, that, or the other thing about it. And I would say that this is actually a time when it's more important than ever for the United States to engage in international legal mechanisms and in conversations about international law, these soft law mechanisms, participating in these soft law mechanisms. Because if we look at the national security strategy, and we look at China being, as we put it, sort of our main pacing threat, is usually the language that gets said. China is participating in these international legal mechanisms. China is showing up to meetings. China is signing more and more treaties, becoming parties to more and more treaties. If we even just look at something like the Antarctic Treaty, which the US has been a part of all the way since the beginning. It predates the Outer Space Treaty, a lot of other major international treaties. That treaty was established with the idea towards scientific exploration and education. And it very expressly stated that this was going to be a demilitarized space. There was not going to be military action in the Antarctic. So it was signed at this time of a coming together of nations, an opportunity for there to be, if we think of education also fits into a soft law. It's an influencer, it's a potential attraction point. It is something where there is an ability to influence. But if we look ahead at 5, 10, 15, let's say 23 years from now, there are opportunities and potential, then you could say opportunities and risks that come from the expected evolution of some of these mechanisms. And that would be the Antarctic Treaty, which, as I just said, not militarized, although you can have dual use, founded on education, scientific exploration, and whatnot. In 2048, there's an opportunity for the parties to that treaty, consultative parties, to call for reforms of the treaty. What is one of the things that it's involved there? There is a possibility that the prohibition on exploration and exploitation of natural resources in the Antarctic will be reopened. China has been very involved in the Antarctic Treaty. They became a party after us, but they have now built, particularly in recent years, multiple facilities in Antarctica. They are really increasing their presence there. They participate in those meetings and whatnot. And there has been a lot of talk, as there has been talk internationally, about where are opportunities for exploring more natural resources on this planet and elsewhere. I mean, there's even been talk of exploring meteors and whatnot. And that's just one example of, there are international mechanisms, there are cases where conversations are happening. And if the United States is not engaging in these conversations, we miss the opportunity to influence through either attraction or positive feelings, or through concrete participation. And putting through our suggestions for language and whatnot on these mechanisms. So I think it's really important that we engage. We don't have to like the institutions that we're engaging with. We don't have to agree with the other people in the room, the other countries in the room. We can engage and vehemently disagree with what is being discussed. But the key there is engage. Because if we are not participating in these conversations, then what will happen is that people and countries will talk about us and not with us. And we are missing opportunities to then influence by attraction, influence through soft power. And if we're not there, other countries will step in one way or the other. You can think about China's Brick and Road Initiative and a lot of the influence that we have seen in countries of the funding that China is giving for different kinds of projects through that, for instance, educational opportunities that they are offering individuals from countries participating in Belt and Road, et cetera, right? So if we are not there, someone else might be. So that's a reason that's very important. And as a final thought, which then I'll pause because I know we want time for questions, but when people say, again, well, with everything going on, does international law really matter? Right? For instance, Putin, invades Ukraine, and yes, everyone is saying that this violates international law and norms and whatnot. But what does that really mean? Does it matter since he did it anyway? And what I say is, yes, he did do that. But before he did, and ever since he did, Russia has been very careful to say, this is the international law justification for what we are doing. We are doing this and we have legal right to do it because. And if international law didn't matter, and if the institutions that are built from international law didn't matter, then they wouldn't bother to say that. And they're not the only country that's done that. I can give you other examples of things that have happened in recent years where we may think, this is so egregious, this is a violation. Guess what? Someone bothered to frame it in the language and within the rubric of these mechanisms. So the mechanisms still matter, because if they didn't, we wouldn't be talking about it.
Thanks, Andrew. All right, thank you. I have a bit of a story, kind of a personal story. It's a little bit like Jody's, but you'll obviously hear some differences. And it starts with, it brings to mind an expression, which is that the worst thing that can happen in gambling is to win the first bet, because winning first convinces you that the odds are in your favor, even as you might be going bankrupt. And that essentially describes my experience in Afghanistan. My first deployment there, you mentioned I've been there 4 times. The first was a winning bet that convinced me that we could win the war. And the 3 that followed, they gave me plenty of evidence to the contrary, but I never let go of the idea that we could win. So then we lost. We lost to the Taliban, and it nearly broke me. I mean, my confidence in the United States, especially in Western or American values, whatever that was supposed to mean to me at the time, but also just kind of my self-confidence, it all nearly collapsed. And I mean, I probably had a more concentrated experience of this based on my deployments, but it doesn't feel like I'm alone in that reaction. It does seem like disillusionment or cynicism about American values is fairly common least out there in the country and the world. And sorry, lost my train of thought, disillusionment and cynicism about American values. But oh yeah, sorry. No, I hear it mainly in certain kinds of questions. You know, it's just whether our foreign policy is a series of disasters. Who are we to impose our values on the world? You know, in some contexts, maybe even are we the oppressor? It does feel provocative sometimes to say, or even to believe, that we're the good guy. But that's my argument. We are a force for good. We are the good guy. We do represent freedom and equality and opportunity. And we represent those ideals imperfectly. I'm not going to sit here and argue for our perfection by any means. I'm also not going to argue that Afghanistan went well. I mean, it was a debacle. But the way the war ended, I have come to understand, is actually a testament to our values and to the goodness, the hope that the world can see in us. And how that could be my conclusion is the story that I have. I don't think I'll need to explain a whole lot of the context. It's really just before and after of 1979, though, to set up my own understanding of this. You know, Afghanistan was at least relatively stable before 1979, in the mid 20th century at least. Soviets invaded, the 80s were the Soviet occupation. That ends, the 90s, the Taliban rose to power. It was the Taliban regime. I mean, it's just decades of these brutal regimes and occupations. After 1979, one place was unconquered and sort of outside of those occupations, and that place was Panjshir province. It's a small, it's rugged mountain valley it's kind of in the Himalayan foothills. It's in the Hindu Kush in the northeast part of the country. It was what survived all that. It's where the Northern Alliance fought from. And it's also worth pointing, you know, them having resisted the Soviets and the Taliban. It's also worth pointing out, it's where we, the United States, first went into Afghanistan after September 11th. It was CIA officers, but they went into Panjshir and they were welcomed there by the Northern Alliance. So that place, you know, this very, in a very literal way, even just this kind of mountain fortress, but also this beacon of resistance through those decades. That's where I spent my first year there. That was the bet that I won. And I was there as a civil engineer at the time. I was on a provincial reconstruction team, mostly military. There's about 30 of us. We had some civilians. We had Department of State, USAID, Department of Agriculture rep at one point. We built roads, bridges, schools, all that sort of infrastructure. But the more important work was working with the local government to build their capacity. And they were already pretty capable. They were strong and self-sufficient. The corruption was minimal and the province was safe. We didn't wear body armor. There are very few places in the country that could have said that at the time. I carried a gun all year. I never once thought that I might need to use it. Everywhere that we stopped, kids would run to us, and that was boys and girls. And they asked us for pens. They didn't want candy and soccer balls. I mean, they wanted education. Panjshir felt like nothing but potential. And all of those reasons, more still, but I'll spare you all the details, but all of those reasons made it the most symbolic place that I have ever been. I mean, its history and its identity were that it was unconquerable. As you drove up the valley, you could see the high water mark of the Soviet invasion. It was where the rusting tanks stopped appearing in the hillsides and on the mountaintops. And so I spent a year there, and based on the successes that I thought that I saw, but especially just kind of based on that spirit of the place that I absorbed, that was the only future that I could imagine for Afghanistan writ large. The second and third deployments were quite different. In those, as Ron mentioned, I led bomb squads that were responding to roadside bombs in Kandahar. Kandahar was the home of the Taliban, but it's a hostile desert. It's geographically and ideologically the opposite of Panjshir. All I can really say on Kandahar is that it was war. Like any of the good things about Panjshir, like Kandahar just felt like what I imagined war would be. And so I finished those two deployments, frankly, pessimistic, but that was limited in its scope. I wasn't entirely hopeless. It felt like the Taliban, they could maybe retake the South. They could probably hold that, but they weren't going to get Kabul, in the north. And they certainly weren't going to get Panjshir. So the fourth time there, was 10 years after the first. It was 2017, so about 17 years into the war. I was at the headquarters in Kabul, and I was working on airfield infrastructure, but these kind of like countrywide programs that I could just look back at the record and see the failures in the prior years. The futility of this was really painfully obvious. But from Kabul, you can still see Panjshir on the horizon. I mean, it was still there. Like every time I got on a plane, like I just kind of looked and wished that I was there instead. It was still unconquered, and I trusted that that had to mean something. It did. We all kind of know where this leads, but in mid-August of 2021, the Afghan government fell, and maybe the war ended at the end of August when the last American troops left. But really, for me, it ended at the end of September, and that's when Panjshir fell too. When the Taliban finally got to that last unconquered place, and it was the last holdout in 2021, but they fully took it. And when that happened, I have never felt such a sense of anger or bitterness or foolishness, really. I mean, I had done a lot of other things in my career, before and in the span of time of those deployments, but my whole professional but emotional investment was wrapped up in Afghanistan. And so it just made my whole career feel like a delusion. Really, it's not an overstatement to call it a crisis of faith. And it was just, if I've hit a rock bottom, it was that. That was a low point in my life, but it's also where the story starts getting better, because it actually is hopeful. Bear with me. What saved me and what allowed me to climb out of that hole was the fact that I had seen other parts of the world, particularly Europe and the Pacific. And what I saw there were reconstructed and thriving countries and cultures and even whole continents that had looked to us for help in the wake of World War II. Because Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany consumed the world in violence and destruction in World War II. But Tokyo and Berlin are magnificent today. Japan and Germany are two of our closest allies, and they are forces for good in the world. What I saw in Europe and the Pacific were free and open societies that, again, they looked to us for help, either for their more immediate reconstruction in the aftermath of the war, but also for their eventual freedom and liberation decades or even half a century or more later. And I still see more that want to join us when I look around, like Ukraine. Ukraine is fighting for its future as a free country. It's very much fighting for its existence. But Ukrainians aren't fleeing east to Russia. The last estimate that I've heard is that it's about 7 million refugees who have moved west across Europe and elsewhere. And that's that direction that people move in times of need, I think, tells you all that you need to know. It's also what told me what I needed to know about the end of Afghanistan, because the same thing was true there. Afghans weren't riding retreating Soviet tanks back to Moscow in 1989. I mean, to be diplomatic about it, Afghans, in my experience, still aren't fond of Russia. But in 2021, they ran toward us desperately. An Afghan couple handed their baby over a razor wire fence to US Marines in the desperate hope of getting their child to freedom. And Marines are a lethal force. I mean, that's what they're known for. Our enemies fear them with good reason. But when those Afghan parents saw Marines, they didn't feel fear. They felt hope with good reason. They entrusted their child to us, and their faith was rewarded. They were all reunited, and they flew west together on an Air Force cargo plane. And that all happened at the end of a disastrous 20-year war. I mean, that war lasted half of my life. I can't explain why it lasted as long as it did. I mean, we can unpack that more in the conversation afterwards. I have very different ideas now than I did before about the limits of American influence and about some of our foreign policy. But I know, based on how the war ended, that our values and our ideals do matter to the world, whether we like it or not, and whether we even believe it or not. And one problem, I think, with being an idealist is that when you come up short, which is inevitable, your enemies will attack you for it. But the bigger problem is actually self-confidence. An ideal doesn't die when someone calls you a hypocrite. It dies when you let go of it. I nearly let go, but nearly 100,000 Afghans came west with us as the Taliban took over their country, and more would have come if they could have. Their faith is ultimately what restored mine. They saw the good in us, and they saw that we're the good guys. Don't take my word for it, take theirs. Thank you. Yes.
Yes.
That's a disclaimer. Thank you,
Yes,
please.
so, okay, we were speaking today here in our individual capacities. These are our thoughts and not those of the US government, the US Army War College, in my case, Northeastern University. We are just speaking in our individual capacities.
Thank
They
you.
make us say that. And the lawyer then reminds them.
I should have it in my government. But I want to say, we're going to open the floor to questions just in just 1 second. But when we talk about soft power, right, one of the fascinating things about, we talk about it is, that it's this power to attract, power of ideals, it's the power of that. One of the complicated elements of soft power is it's unclear whether you can do anything to get soft power. But soft power is often the result of who you are, or often the result of long-term cooperation, or long-term participating in every boring meeting that you go to. Right? You can't suddenly decide to turn on soft power. One of the fascinating things, if you look at, especially the Chinese talk a lot about establishing Chinese soft power as if it's something that you can order, up. And I'm always reminded of a television commercial for Beck's beer, of all places. And it is a bare room with a couch and a table with a record player. And a guy walks in who's wearing a white shirt and a tie and slacks, is clearly very uptight. And he puts on a record, and the record says, with this heavy German accent, says, "Today we are going to learn how to relax." Step 1, lie down on couch. And so you see the guy lie down on the couch. Step 2, begin relaxing now. The punchline of the commercial is, right, Beck's, Germans aren't good at relaxing. What we're good at is beer, buy Beck's beer. Whenever I hear any government agency talk about how we're going to establish or create or somehow, express our soft power, I think about that German guy, following instructions on how to relax, right? And that's, based on what all of you have talked about, right, is that, and this was, and it's important, right? When Joe Nye comes up with the idea of soft power, right, he's responding in part to a very late 80s fear that people had, that the United States was becoming weaker. It goes back to Paul Kennedy's book, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. And what Nye wanted to say is, yes, the United States may be running deficits. Yes, the United States might have its problems, right? Yes, the United States might not be the vigorous imperial force that it once was, but the United States has this attraction. It's the ideals, but it's also blue jeans and rock and roll. And it's being willing to actually have partners and work with partners. Now, Nye started, when Kennedy wrote The Rise and Fall of Great Powers in 1988, there was a lot of fear of American decline. Nye starts working on what becomes the book Bound to Lead, in between, which is published in 1990. In between comes 1989, which is the moment where this, allegedly declining United States that was going to, stumble faced with the vigorous Soviet Union doesn't stop, right? And it is the other empire that fades, and its people rise up because they talk about their freedom, because they want to be free, because they want what free societies offer, because of American soft power. And so that's just something to fit in with what you've heard today. So I know, open the floor to questions. Christine has the microphone if you don't feel like raising your voice, but the floor is yours. So start right here.
I've spent a lot of time in China over the past 35 years. And one of my first experiences there, literally, 38 years ago, I should say, 1987, was a meeting of American and Chinese officials in Beijing. And I made the offhand remark at that meeting about how had a very strong power in the world. It mentioned various elements of soft power, and the Chinese came back completely mystified by what I'd said. They said, well, we've got tanks and we've got airplanes, we've got lots of power too. And I mean, they had no idea of soft power. Now, if you go to a similar meeting today, as you said, they'll talk a lot about soft power. And the question is, can they succeed? They've invested a lot of money in the Confucius Institutes around the world and so on and so forth. And it seems to me, and I heard mentioned earlier about situation Pacific gives you faith, that a lot of the small Pacific Island nations seem attracted by Chinese soft power. And I wonder if you comment on that.
Sure. Yeah, so when I think of the Pacific, like what I've seen specifically to the extent that I've been there is Japan and South Korea. So those are the kind of major, they feel to me like the major economic, and cultural success stories of, post-war recovery. And certainly it's not the entire Pacific. It's a bit broad. I mean, it does seem like one of the challenges, especially in the Pacific and, China's backyard, is Ron's point, like whether or not they're actually projecting soft power or they're just trying to buy influence and access. They have a lot more mechanisms to do that. I mean, it's the benefit of a command economy. Like you can build infrastructure, you can do things over the long range that make it hard, that just feel hard to compete with from a democratic system where we're talking, much less, quantitative things in terms of money and payoff and, infrastructure. So yeah, it's how you compete with that in the like near, China and the Pacific especially. It's hard for me to imagine how far we can really take it in our current model of, international engagement and development. But it does still feel like the long game, the grand strategy or whatever you want to call it, of like which system actually represents a desirable system, and how do we still draw people in that direction, even if we have to overcome, direct Chinese investment in, whatever you want to call what they're doing, whether it's soft power or something else.
Yeah.
Jody, your experience?
Yeah, I was gonna say, because when I was last working at the embassy in Beijing as well, like the one thing we were focusing on at the time was a country, Palau, one of the small island nations. And when I observed that, like, I didn't see it as soft power. I saw it as very much transactional power, a little bit of coercion, a little bit of gray zone activity. And one of the students asked that same question today, and then they're coming from South Asia, Pakistan, Iran area, saying the same thing. Like China is gaining more influence in soft power, but it's not soft power. It's immediate benefit in the short term that people are seeing. Hey, if I can align with China now, here are the largely economic benefits that I can gain now. But that's very different than what soft power means long range. Soft power is more tied to values. That there might be some persons in government that would say, hey, China has soft power over me because I see their form of government, they're very authoritarian system, and I wish I could do that in my country. And that's where China builds their own soft power in those countries. But individual citizens, I can't imagine that they'd want to be part of that value system. And that's why, like they said, people in crisis flee to the US, because I think that's what soft power is. Soft power is about who you are and what you represent. And I think we still have it's a monopoly. We still have the most potent soft power out there. China's doesn't compare.
Interesting. Let's go. Is there somebody else right down there?
So in the West now, recently, Panama's been a topic of conversation. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the strategic importance of the Panama Canal and, what steps you think the US should be taking there. And then the last comments kind of also remind or made me think about Cuba sitting so close to the United States, yet you haven't had any success there in exercising soft power. If you could talk about that, if you have any background there.
Okay. Let's take that in reverse. So Cuba, so and this, I'm not trying to not answer your question, but,
It's like, you don't have to try, you can actively.
but actually, so it depends, so on the Cuba thing, I'm gonna push back a little bit. You said, you know, soft power hasn't seemed to work. I guess my question is, well, in that context, what are you thinking of as soft power? Because if you go to Cuba, there is a tremendous amount of American cultural influence in Cuba. We have had actually some success, if you will, of influencing at an individual and then a community-based level on things outside of foreign defense. So on music and art and cultural exchanges and whatnot, and as we re-engage with Cuba, I guess it was probably a decade ago now, or more, we started with that. And if you ask individual people in Cuba, America is looked at as, you're not talking about a place of attraction, okay? That there is we want to be like America. We want to go to America. America is this ideal. America fights communism. America stands up for rights, all of this sort of thing. So I actually think soft power is working quite well in many ways in Cuba. Second part of the question, Panama. So the Panama Canal has been a strategic location since before there was a Panama Canal. That's why we wanted a Panama Canal. You know, we of course helped construct it. And with a lot, it was not just the United States, with a lot of help of local labor and labor that we imported, or we helped bring to that area and whatnot. It continues to remain to be vital, not just to the United States, but to international trade, transit, whatnot, economic flows. You know, it's true, we don't physically control it anymore. But when we think about what are opportunities for things that a government does that a private sector could do better or differently, managing a port seems to be the kind of thing that the private sector and international businesses would be more appropriate, depending, right? But you can see contexts in which this is not something that that a government maybe wants to get involved in unless they have to. Is it true that in the agreement in turning over the canal fully to the government of Panama, there were certain conditions that needed to be met? Yes, and right now there's a debate as to whether those conditions have been met, and could it be that because they have not, if they haven't all been met, would that be grounds to take some kind of action with regard to the agreement? Yes, and so this is where my favorite international law mechanisms come into place. But in all seriousness, right? This is an international agreement between two countries and two states. This is the quintessential international law type question. So how are we going to deal with that? We have to go to these mechanisms and figure out, okay, we also have, this is true, there is a treaty about how to interpret treaties, the Vienna Convention on the Interpretation of Treaties, but like we will go to that and we will look at that and we will say, okay, what is this? This is what the language is. How do we interpret this? What are the dispute resolution provisions of this? How do we deal with that? This again is an opportunity for us to, you know, as one of the steps before the hard D, right? Look at that other D of diplomacy and figure out what might be things that we can engage on. How might we address this? We are stretched in many ways in resources, not just in dollars, but in human resources and other things when it comes to our larger national security and economic apparatuses. Do we want to be spending energy on that or other things? And when we make those kinds of choices, and I mentioned this quote in the talk this morning, for instance, then Secretary of Defense Mattis had in testimony before Congress, he said at one point, he said, you cut the State Department's budget, you need to buy me more ammunition. So when making some of these trade-offs, in this case, you might think maybe looking at the D of diplomacy or some other avenues first, looking at some of these mechanisms that we have that are not hard D, but some of the other Ds, that would be something to consider when thinking about how to engage about whatever our rights may be under the agreements regarding the Panama Canal or elsewhere.
That's very good. I will say one thing before we go to your question, sir, too, is that one could have a very long and very interesting discussion about whether economic power is hard power or soft power.
Yeah.
Because you will find people will say soft power and they mean economic.
Yeah.
power. And yet,
Like, where do sanctions fit in there? Is
yeah,
that
I
a
mean,
hard
well,
thing or a
where
soft thing?
does the very real material leverage that money gives you is different than the informal power of attraction that comes with cultural influence, right? So, you know, money talks, but it talks different ways. Go ahead, Jody, and then we'll take your questions.
And I understand where the concern is coming from, because, you know, Panama and Cuba are right in our backyard, but China's access to ports, whether it's the government or a state-owned enterprise, really started back in 2013. When China announced their One Belt, One Road initiative. It turned into the BRI. And that's been $1 trillion of investment across 68 countries. And, you know, their design is to link trade routes from Asia into Africa and Europe. And from an economic sense, it's not a threat, it's part of competition. But there could be a military aspect to it, especially when it comes to those kind of ports and strategic choke points. You know, India is very concerned because they're seeing China influencing, you know, Myanmar to their east, you got Pakistan to the left, and then Sri Lanka to their south, where they loaned Sri Lanka a bunch of money that they knew Sri Lanka couldn't pay back, and now Sri Lanka signed a 99 lease because, you know, they had to. So now a Chinese state-owned enterprise owns a majority of the strategic port right under India. So it expanded from the South China Sea into South Asia, into Djibouti at that critical juncture where, you know, we were comfortable in our strategic positioning there. Now we see China open up a base alongside, and now it's coming into our hemisphere. So I think if that's where you're concerned, I don't know the answer to that, but I can see that is a threat. And right now it's economic. So we're not worried about China 2025. I think we're worried about what China can do with all that access in 2050.
Go ahead, sir.
Thank you. You build up on, hear me? Yeah, you build up on how long it takes to build soft power, and you went back to post-World War II and the institutions that were built there, etc. And granted, the US has done an admirable job. But what happens if you start doing the opposite? You start pulling out of the WHO, the WTO, Climate Accord. You start questioning sovereignties of, you know, nations, Denmark, Greenland, Canada, etc. And you basically, I mean, what all of you said, you know, you start flaunting things that are internationally agreed on, whether they're, you know, legal or not, but flaunting these agreed upon rules and mores, if you want. How quickly can you lose that soft power? And if so, what would it take to build back up?
Oh, hey, look at the time. I guess. Anybody want to take that? Yeah, I'll go ahead.
Yeah, no.
I'm gonna count on the Air Force to show up first. Go ahead.
No, I mean, I think I share your concern. I mean, it does, and it's, I don't know, in my lifetime or in my career, like it has felt kind of volatile, like just between administrations or, you know, decades, this is swinging back and forth. I find myself just kind of taking the long view, which is that it ebbs and flows. I mean, maybe this is all just going to be the nebulous way of saying that it's an ongoing project. You know, we're seeking more perfection. We don't have it right now or any other moment. But like even in the past, you know, there have been prior eras of isolationism. There have been times when, frankly, like we look back and we have things that, you know, the decisions our country has made, that the United States has made, we have looked back on it. In some cases, we've, you know, regretted, apologized for, even paid reparations for. Even as those things happened over the decades and the centuries, like I think the soft power was still there. Like the ideals were still there, and there was still an attraction for much of the world, or some of the world anyway, despite whatever the, you know, the daily or yearly or, you know, whatever the evolving conditions might have been. And so I do find myself trying to derive reassurance from that, even as, you know, administrations change and policies change. But it has survived over time nonetheless.
And I'll tag onto his answer and say, you think of some of this as a very new phenomenon, that somehow it's new, that we are in, we are out, or we change our positions on certain things. But we can look back at, for instance, during the Cold War, within the UN system. What did we participate in? What didn't we participate in? What did we show up to, but we didn't want to be a party to? So there's some treaties, for instance, that we had not become parties to until the fall of the Berlin Wall and until under H.W. Bush, which notably participated in the UN and was quite a believer in rules-based order in the international system. But it's under him that we ratified several human rights treaties that we had not done for decades. So that some could point to as that's a shift. And even when those treaties weren't signed by the US, even though they aligned with things in our Bill of Rights and things that we are very clearly within our national purpose, national interests, national values, it didn't diminish those values by us not being a party to a treaty. So even if we are not on paper a participant in something, doesn't mean that that is not aligned with our values or that our values are somehow not reflected in that entity.
Jody, did you want to answer this?
Yeah, I think.
All right, so we have we have time for one more question. Go ahead, sir.
One last question.
Great.
One last question. I'm sorry. If you can't tell, I'm from Australia.
Is it on? The green light on?
It's flashing red and green.
Just press it once, press it once.
It's working. Okay, I'll try. Anyway, I'll shout it. I'll shout it.
You're from Australia.
We're Australia. I've got a master's in international law, so another lawyer specializing in law act. So I just want to say first and foremost, thank you for your service, for your efforts, particularly as someone who's a foreigner, who's not from here. I feel like I can speak a little bit about firsthand experience about US soft power. So thank you. Thank you for sharing your stories, some of them which were obviously quite deep personal experiences. I have a bunch of questions and it's kind of tagging on to my predecessors, but I just want to posit something out there that maybe we're actually entering a lot of selective multilateralism in which the US doesn't totally withdraw. And I'm thinking in particular with Indo-Pac, where Australia, for instance, has this big dilemma where we have a national security partner of choice being the US, but our biggest foreign investor. But our biggest trading partner is China. And while it's quite easy for Australia to pick one lane or the other based on soft power and democratic values and all that kind of thing, you can imagine other states where the tension, you mentioned Palau, Micronesian states, all that kind of thing. So I just want to posit maybe it's not as, and you're right, there's ebbs and flows. Maybe it's not as dramatic and awful as what we initially feel within the first 2 weeks of this new administration, but maybe it's a little bit more selective than just a total retreat to right as might, gunboat diplomacy, that kind of thing. So sorry, not really.
I like that kind of optimism. But I will say in general, right, is relationships don't have, one would like to think relationships don't have finish lines, right? Nations don't have finish lines. Right? It's the journey, not the destination. Right? And so, sometimes you go faster, sometimes you go slower, sometimes you take a detour, sometimes you go more directly, right? That, one can imagine, right? How fast can you lose? You can lose your reputation very quickly if you're not careful. But you don't have to lose your reputation because of one mistake, depending on how good you are at communicating what it is you think you're doing, right? And so it's more of a, when one wants to make a change, when a state wants to make a change, right? The challenge is how do you communicate that change, right? What is the purpose that you're following, and what are you still trying to accomplish? And so it's about telling stories.
Well, I love your comment about an ideal you just stop believing it when someone calls you a hypocrite. It's when you stop believing it.
Yeah, totally. Right. Any final comments from the panel? No? Good. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today, and please support FPRI in the future, and strength and wisdom.